From the KATC TV3 studios, this is Weathering the Storm.
Good evening and welcome to this year's edition of Weathering the Storm. It seems just like yesterday that we were discussing the 2014 hurricane season.
Well, the 2015 season is now upon us, and we want to help make sure that you're prepared should a storm come Acadiana's way.
So over the next half hour, we're going to tell you what you need to know going into this season and a look back at a historic season that's already a decade gone by.
But before we take a look at the storms of the past, let's take a look at this year's forecast. The 2015 hurricane season is here, and as many of you have heard, the forecast is calling for a below average year in terms of number of storms. Early forecasts have called for 7 named storms, 3 of them hurricanes, and out of those 3, 1 could be a major storm. It's important to remember that forecasts such as this are a rough guide. They don't address where the storms could hit or even how strong the storms could become. And while forecasting science is getting better, there are a lot of factors to consider. And this year, one of the biggest factors is the onset of El Nino.
At this point, we think we're going to have a pretty healthy, moderate to strong El Nino this year, which should, we think, make the season a lot less active than an average season.
This has major effects on the development of tropical systems in the Atlantic Basin.
Warmer than normal waters in the central and eastern tropical Pacific increase upper level winds, tear apart developing storms in the Atlantic.
This year, forecasters also took a look at sea surface temperatures, another factor that could limit the development of tropical systems in the Atlantic Basin.
The tropical Atlantic is fairly cool right now. It's about as cool as it's been since the early 1990s, and cooler water means less fuel for the storms that are trying to form.
While the forecast calls for a lower number of storms to develop, and there will be multiple factors working against storm development, it doesn't mean you shouldn't be prepared, as the Gulf Coast has already proven that it doesn't necessarily go along with El Nino trends.
Actually, Louisiana is the one state where the probability of landfall is actually higher in El Nino years than in neutral and La Nina years. So, unfortunately for the Gulf Coast, it doesn't really impact the odds as much.
So we should all treat this season the same way we treat every other one. Be equally prepared. As Louisiana can see a lot more activity during El Nino years, and those storms could develop right here in the Gulf. So we should definitely be prepared for this hurricane season, just in case we see increased level activity close to home.
Well, still to come on Weathering the Storm, we hear about storm surge and how it floods coastal areas. But what about towns that are farther inland? We'll answer that question next on Weathering the Storm.
When it comes to hurricanes, we hear run from the water and hide from the wind. Storm surge flooding can be deadly to coastal areas and even farther inland where elevations remain low, like right here in Louisiana. Should I stay or should I go? That's always the question on people's mind when hurricanes are approaching. Over the past decade, South Louisiana has been inundated with storm surge flooding 4 times. Katrina, Rita, Gustav, and Ike. Rita and Ike were hurricanes that made landfall well away from Acadiana, but our area suffered some of the worst coastal storm surge flooding since Hurricane Audrey in 1957. Much of Iberia, Vermilion, and Cameron parishes saw a new standard of flooding beyond a level that had held for nearly half a century. Mandatory evacuations are most likely for our coastal parishes south of the Intracoastal Waterway. But what if you live farther inland? What kind of storm surge flooding can you expect? It all depends on the height of the surge and your elevation. Knowing both could help you make your evacuation decision. Let's use a scenario of a Category 4 hurricane expecting a 20-foot storm surge. Main Street is one of the highest points in Franklin. Much of the city west of the railroad tracks is below 10 feet. Some areas near the canal are as low as 3 feet above sea level. This could put well over 10 feet of water over these areas. Now, the elevation here on Main Street in Franklin is about 10 feet. A 20-foot storm surge would take the waters almost as high as the top of the banners on the light posts. While here in New Iberia's Main Street, the elevation is a little bit higher, you'll be better off, but even with a 20-foot storm surge, you could still have water to the top of this railing here in Bulleney Plaza. Downtown New Iberia escaped storm surge flooding over the past decade, but water has reached US 90 and has covered LA 14 just to the west. But if the center of a Category 4 were to push inland over Vermilion Parish, St. Mary and Iberia could have water almost to the levees along the Atchafalaya Basin. Delcambre has made major changes since Hurricane Rita. Most houses in the flood-prone areas have been elevated, others haven't. Some have been abandoned for 10 years. Most of the elevated homes survived flooding when Hurricane Ike sent water up the Delcambre Canal.
Well, when you work your way into Delcambre, the elevation is just a mere 4 feet above sea level. You get a 20-foot storm surge coming up the Delcambre Canal. That's going to put 16 feet of water in this town alone. And then to Magdalen Square, downtown Abbeville. Elevation just 11 feet. You get a 20-foot storm surge, and most of downtown Abbeville will be inundated.
Now, areas north of LA 14 see a more significant increase in elevation, although Kaplan, Gaydon, and Lake Arthur would likely see storm surge flooding. But more east, Youngsville and Cade are closer to 30 feet in elevation and should be relatively safe from actual storm surge flooding. To help warn the public of the dangers of the storm surge, the National Hurricane Center will be issuing storm surge watches and warnings for the first time this season. The maps were tested last year and are designed to help give the public a clear understanding of where and how high storm surge will be rising. A message that the National Hurricane Center is working hard to get across to the public and to put a focus on the different dangers a tropical system can create.
Which wind hazards, which water hazards, and not just for preparedness purposes, but in our collection of products and warnings, we are focusing them more and more on the individual hazards.
While the maps and warnings are an additional tool to use, it would be a good idea to familiarize yourself with the flood zones and if you're located in one.
Well, while storm surge maps can help you plan appropriately for a storm, it's a different kind of map that helps emergency responders plan rescue efforts in the immediate aftermath of a storm. Researchers at the U.S. Geological Survey use radar satellite to see through a storm's clouds to find what areas, if any, are inundated with water after a storm makes landfall. Those maps are then passed on to local and federal authorities who use them to conduct search and rescue operations. This technology was vital to rescue efforts following Hurricanes Ike and Sandy.
These maps, you could just pinpoint and they would give you the lat longs and they would go to those areas and see. It gave them the regional perspective where the flooding was. And so yes, we directly help the search and rescue in that sense. We give them the maps.
And if a storm threatens the South Louisiana coast, or even the Texas coast for that matter, parts of Acadiana could be forced to evacuate because of the possibility of major flooding. And as our Micah Hatfield tells us, residents should be prepared just in case.
When hurricanes strike, safety is most important. So when the governor declares a state of emergency and police call for evacuations,
don't wait until we say Lafayette. It's time for you to evacuate, and you're down in southern Vermilion or St. Mary Parish, and then you're trying to evacuate, taking US 90 up, and you get to Lafayette and you're in a traffic jam.
I-49, I-10, US 90, and US 167 are all evacuation routes, but they are not all used during every hurricane.
It's determined on the track of the hurricane, obviously. If it looks like it's more going to a westerly track, we'll obviously send them more north or towards Mississippi.
Master Trooper Brooks David says the police are already preparing for hurricane season, and it is important that the public does too. When a hurricane is coming, make sure you are not caught without the necessary emergency supplies.
If they know a hurricane's coming, make sure you have fuel in your car and all necessary equipment like radio, water, food, in case something happens on the roadway where they are stuck for a while because of traffic jams.
And for those that don't choose to evacuate, don't expect law enforcement to be able to help you in the eye of the storm.
We can't be out there in the hurricane trying to get people out when we're in harm's way ourselves. We can't get to you if we're not safe.
Micah Hatfield's KATC TV3.
When we return on Weathering the Storm, we'll turn the clock back 10 years and look back at Hurricanes Katrina and Rita and the lasting impacts they made on Louisiana. That's next on Weathering the Storm. It's been been 10 years since the 2005 hurricane season shattered the record for the most active season.
And on June 8th, Tropical Storm Arlene formed in the Western Caribbean, starting a season that would continue into the following January, with the final storm, Tropical Storm Zeta, developing on December 30th, 6 hours short of the record for the latest storm. The season would include 28 named storms, 15 hurricanes, 7 major hurricanes Category 3 or higher, and 4 storms reaching Category 5 strength, including Hurricane Katrina.
And Katrina would become the costliest storm in U.S. history, both in terms of money and lives. It reshaped a coastline, redefined a city, and became the storm all others would be compared to. It became the storm many had feared for years, forcing the first ever mandatory evacuation of the city of New Orleans. Katrina made landfall at 5:10 a.m. on August the 29th as a strong Category 3 storm. Less than 3 hours later, the first of the levee breaches had been announced, leaving the greater New Orleans area devastated and parts of the area uninhabitable for several weeks. Less than a month later, the Gulf Coast braced itself for yet another major storm, Hurricane Rita.
The Cat 5 storm would deal another blow to the Gulf Coast region, affecting many in Acadiana. Our Alex Labat headed to one of the hardest hit areas where it is still fresh in the minds of its residents a decade later.
We had flooded in the past, but it was just in certain areas. And we could go in to help these people because we hadn't flooded. But this time, everybody flooded.
Even 10 years later, the memories and emotions of late September 2005 are still with Mayor John LeBlanc. The fourth most intense Atlantic hurricane ever recorded made landfall on September 24th. What would follow would set back recovery efforts for the state after the massive blow that was Hurricane Katrina. And while ERAF did not feel the full force of Katrina, it too was dealt a blow before Rita ever made landfall.
I was here. The mayor was dying on me, and I had to take the reins because he could no longer function. So it started before we were hit.
What would hit ERAF would be a surge of water that would affect an estimated 4,000 out of 5,000 residents, 9 feet of water that would not recede for days.
Oh my God!
On the highway at the red light, I stopped and parked, and I could see the water coming in from the canal, and it was just coming in swirling with marsh grass and mud, and I watched the shed just pretty much get torn down and float off.
Wayne Mouton was then fire chief of the town of ERAF, who says the lessons from Katrina helped the town both prepare and to repair.
So we encouraged them to leave, and those that said they weren't leaving, we were able to kind of jot down on a little map that the mayor's office provided who was staying and where and how many people.
160 people would remain in the town during the storm, some having to be rescued by boat, many losing almost all of what they had, which is why when Mayor Kathleen Blanco arrived in Vermilion Parish, both she and LeBlanc broke down at the sight of another city submerged.
When the governor drove up and she stepped out of that black Suburban, I'll never forget that as long as I live, I broke down. And today, I'm still emotional over it. But she lived up to what she promised us.
A promise to bring ERAF back, and it is. But while LeBlanc says another event like Rita isn't a question of if, but when, he also says there's no question that ERAF will always bounce back.
We went through so much. People came together, even with the tragedy that had happened. We're Cajuns, and that's how we are.
In ERAF, I'm Alex Labat for KATC TV3.
In addition to major flooding and property damage, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita also delivered another major blow to Louisiana: coastal erosion. And as our Valerie Poncetti explains, those storms are still having effect on the coast 10 years later.
Experts say it only takes one storm to cause several years' worth of coastal damage.
One hurricane can cause as much damage in one event in days as it might take decades to account for the other color on this map.
Louisiana loses 25 to 35 square miles of wetlands a year, without any storms at all.
They do come in spurts. The period of the early 2000s where we had Katrina and Rita, Gustav, Ike, other hurricanes, they come sort of in these groups, and then we can go periods without hurricanes.
Deputy Director at the National Wetlands Research Center, Thomas Doyle, says once a storm is over, the damage continues to spread as saltwater from the storm surges creeps up into Louisiana's freshwater.
It actually is part of a longer process that's less direct. It's more indirect, but it's actually the process that raises salt salinity or soil salinities in the freshwater wetland side of the system that eventually allows for marsh to migrate upslope.
That soil salinity can cause more erosion and kill wildlife in Louisiana's wetlands, a more permanent problem.
We can have mortality or dieback of these forest systems, and it's really the start of the process of marshes migrating upslope into these wetlands.
While there is no single solution, wetlands experts in Louisiana are doing all they can to continue to protect the wetlands and slow down the erosion process. In Lafayette, Valerie Poncetti, KATC, TV3.
And coming up next on Weathering the Storm, state homeland security officials are ready for a hurricane should one come our way.
We'll take you inside GOSEP's command center when Weathering the Storm returns.
Welcome back. With hurricane season comes emergency preparedness. In Baton Rouge, state officials are using the lessons they learned 10 years ago during hurricanes Katrina and Rita to gear up for the season. As our Stephen Albritton reports, those past storms have state leadership ready for the next direct hit.
The state of Louisiana is confident they are ready for whatever may come next.
One of the huge challenges during Katrina and Rita were communications amongst law enforcement and EMS and those first responder communities. Louisiana has spent a tremendous amount of money and time over the last 10 years to really build a system that is second to none.
Deputy Director Chris Gilbo with the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, or GOSEP, says after the destruction caused by those storms, they made sure being able to stay connected to first responders and officials across the state was a priority.
We believe it's going to make a significant change in the traffic and in the amount of time and the synchronization to get folks out during an evacuation.
Gilbo says 80,000 users are now on the radio network, which has stood up strong in more recent storms. His office also holds the command center where all info comes in and out of. Just recently, they ran a mock emergency scenario to test their systems and to make sure everyone in leadership is on the same page when the worst case scenario hits our shores.
We encourage folks to listen to the local leadership. They will be the ones to declare an emergency and to declare an evacuation, and that's where it starts at.
Now, although it's been a few years since there's been a direct hit from a hurricane in Acadiana, GOSEP stresses to always be prepared, especially for those of you who have recently moved to the Gulf Coast and have never experienced a hurricane. Because as I like to say, all it takes is one. Reporting in Baton Rouge, Stephen Albritton, KATC, TV3.
An experience can certainly be a great tool in helping to get prepared for hurricane season, as recent memory will often make people more alert. But after several quiet seasons, one of the biggest problems may be complacency. It's been 10 years since the last major hurricane has hit the U.S., and when asked about memories of storms past, the answers are beginning to sound a bit like this.
And I remember Ike. I think it was Ike.
And while everyone remembers the big storms, the gap between them has some officials worried that this hurricane season they'll be facing a new set of issues.
The human nature factor is a bigger challenge than the meteorological one.
Specifically, the complacency that comes along with a drought like this, what many meteorologists refer to as weather amnesia.
Break out of the growing complacency and denial that the bad ones happened 10 years ago, they're not going to happen again. That's usually the first thing I worry about is when it's been a long gap between a big hurricane is getting ready for the next big one.
And while the forecast may call for a season with few hurricanes, those numbers mean nothing in how the actual hurricane season will end up being perceived.
How busy the season is has nothing to do with how bad the season will be where you live. We can paint a really different picture if we focus just on how busy the overall season will be.
Which means you can't let complacency become an issue. And regardless of when the last storm hit, you need to be prepared.
What would it look like if that one hurricane that you didn't think would come your way this year does, and you haven't prepared in advance?
So while there is a chance that the drought will continue through its 10th season, there's not a guarantee that this will be the year that the drought actually comes to an end. And if that's the case, you don't want complacency to be a problem. And to stay prepared, you can visit any of these websites to get your checklist and to prepare yourself for a potential storm. GoSep.la.gov, getagameplan.org, or emergency.la.gov. The earlier you're prepared, the better the possible outcome. And we'll have these websites and a hurricane kit checklist at KATC.com.
And we'll be right back to wrap up Weathering the Storm.
Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Weathering the Storm.
Hope you learned something, and hopefully you'll be better prepared.
And if you've missed this, it's going to be on KATC.com, so share with your friends. Be ready for the storms to come. Till then, thank you for joining us from Weathering the Storm.